Richard blinked, thrown off, then muttered something about kids these days and went back to his tablet. Rachel turned back to the window, her face unreadable, but her fingers brushed the edge of her seatbelt, adjusting it slightly. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. They were making a quick stop at Andrews Air Force Base for refueling. Shouldn't be long. Rachel's head lifted slightly, her eyes sharpening as she glanced out at the military runway coming into view. Jets lined the tarmac, their sleek shapes glinting under the sun. Personnel moved with purpose below. Her fingers tightened around her water bottle just for a second before she set it down. Olivia, standing nearby, noticed the shift in Rachel's posture. "Something catch your eye?" she asked, her tone more suspicious than curious. Rachel didn't answer right away. She just kept looking out, her hand still in her lap, like she was seeing something no one else could. As the plane descended toward Andrews, Olivia's voice came over the intercom, crisp and professional. "A few select passengers have been invited to meet the F-22 pilots on the tarmac. Please remain seated unless you've been notified." She glanced at Rachel as she spoke, her eyes making it crystal clear who wasn't on the list. Rachel didn't move. She just took another sip of water, her face blank, like she'd heard it all before. Her fingers brushed the edge of her backpack, where a small patch of a faded eagle caught the light for just a moment before she tucked it out of sight. Tara Wells, the woman with glossy red nails from across the aisle, leaned toward her friend, a blonde in a silk scarf whose name tag read Donovan. "They probably don't want pictures with someone dressed like that," she said, her laugh sharp and practiced. Donovan nodded, her lips curling into a smirk. A quiet chuckle came from the row ahead, where a guy in a designer polo shirt, Ethan Carter, was scrolling through his phone, his smirk visible even from Rachel's seat. A woman in a designer coat paused by Rachel's row as she gathered her things. She looked down at Rachel, her eyes narrowing slightly, and spoke to Olivia in a stage whisper. "You would think they'd screen people better for flights like this," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. Rachel's hands stilled on her backpack. She looked up, her eyes meeting the woman's for a split second. "Screening's not my problem," she said, her voice low and even like a quiet challenge. The woman froze, her drink halfway to her lips, then hurried back to her seat. Rachel leaned back, her expression unchanged, but her fingers tapped once against the armrest, a small, controlled motion. Rachel's eyes flicked to the window where the F-22s stood like sentinels on the tarmac. For a moment, her fingers paused, hovering over the patch on her backpack. She'd sewn it on herself years ago after a mission that left her hands shaking but her squadron alive. The memory came unbidden, a night sky lit by tracer fire, the roar of engines, the weight of decisions no one should have to make. She blinked and the memory faded. She adjusted her hoodie, pulling the sleeves down over her hands, and leaned back in her seat. Major Kyle Bennett stepped into the business class cabin, and the air shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore. His uniform was sharp, his presence sharper. He was in his late 30s, with a jawline carved from stone and eyes that missed nothing. He greeted the invited passengers with polite nods, shaking hands with Richard Hale and Tara Wells, working through the cabin with military efficiency. Then his eyes landed on seat 12F. He froze. His hand was still gripping the last handshake, but his entire body had gone rigid. The cabin didn't notice at first, but Rachel did. She met his gaze, her expression steady like she'd been expecting this moment all along. Her fingers brushed the edge of her seat, a small grounding motion. Bennett released the handshake and walked straight to her row, his boots heavy against the floor. "Are you Shadowhawk 12? He asked, his voice low, almost reverent. Rachel gave a small nod, her eyes never leaving his. Richard Hale snorted softly like he thought it was a joke. Bennett's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away from Rachel. "My apologies for having you sit here," he said, louder now so the whole cabin could hear. "You're invited to the tarmac immediately." Rachel stood, slinging her backpack over one shoulder. Her movements were smooth, precise, like she had done this 100 times before. The cabin buzzed with whispers, but she didn't look back. As Rachel followed Bennett toward the exit, a man in a navy suit leaned out of his seat. "This has to be a mistake," he said, his voice loud and confident. "She doesn't look like anyone important." Rachel's steps didn't falter, but her hand tightened on her backpack strap, her knuckles whitening for a moment. She turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his. "Looks can be deceiving," she said, her voice soft but sharp like a blade slipping through silk. Outside, the air was sharp with jet fuel and wind. Rachel stepped onto the tarmac, her hoodie flapping slightly. The F-22 pilots stood in a straight line, their uniforms crisp, their faces unreadable. Bennett's voice cut through the silence. "Attention! This is Midnight Viper, the one who once led 3 squadrons through enemy skies." The pilots snapped to attention, their hands rising in perfect unison to salute her. Rachel returned the salute, her movements crisp, her expression calm but warm. A faint smile tugged at her lips as she lowered her hand. A young officer approached, carrying an old flight helmet. It was worn but well kept. The call sign Midnight Viper was embroidered in bold letters across the side. Bennett took it and held it out to Rachel. "This helmet is only awarded to a pilot who's completed a top-secret mission," he said, his voice steady but loud enough for the cabin to hear. Rachel took the helmet, her fingers tracing the stitching for a moment. Then she slipped it on, her movements as natural as breathing. The fit was perfect, like it had been made for her. A young pilot, barely out of his 20s, stepped forward, his voice low. "She's the one who saved my squadron," he said. The other pilots straightened, their faces shifting to something like awe. Back inside the cabin, the mood had shifted entirely. Richard Hale froze mid-sip of his drink. Tara Wells stared at her phone, her finger still on the screen. Olivia's forced smile had vanished completely, her hands fumbling with a tray. Then came the roar. 2 F-22s appeared alongside the plane, their wings glinting in the sunlight. Bennett's voice crackled over the radio, clear for everyone to hear. "Midnight Viper, we never got to thank you for last time." Rachel leaned toward the window, her lips curving into a small smile. She pressed the headset she'd been given and spoke, her voice steady. "Hold formation, Eagle One." The response came instantly, a chorus of voices over the radio. "Yes, ma'am." The cabin went completely silent. Mark Ellison, the loud guy with the loosened tie, shifted uncomfortably. Claire Donovan whispered something to Tara, but it was too quiet to hear. Ethan Carter's earlier smirk was completely gone. And then, slowly, a man in a tailored jacket stood up. His face was flushed with embarrassment. I didn't know who you were," he stammered, his voice low but audible. "I'm sorry for what I said earlier." Rachel looked up, meeting his eyes. Her gaze was steady but not unkind. She nodded once, a small acknowledging gesture, and turned back to the window. When the plane landed in D.C., the passengers moved slowly, still processing what they'd witnessed. Rachel stood, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. She didn't rush. She didn't linger. She just walked down the aisle, her steps steady, her head high. At the gate, a man was waiting. He was tall, quiet, with a presence that didn't need words. His suit was tailored but understated, and his eyes locked on Rachel the moment she appeared. He didn't say much, just nodded and fell into step beside her. The cabin fell silent. Ethan Carter dropped his phone mid-text. Claire Donovan looked away, her scarf clutched tightly. Olivia busied herself with paperwork. James Monroe, Rachel's husband, a man whose influence reached places most people couldn't imagine. Before they left the terminal, a young girl, maybe 10 years old, tugged at her mother's sleeve and pointed at Rachel. "Is that the pilot lady?" she whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. The mother, a quiet woman who'd stayed silent during the flight, looked at Rachel and nodded with profound respect. "That's her," she said softly. Rachel caught the girl's eye and gave a small, warm smile. The girl grinned back, clutching her mother's hand tighter. The consequences came quietly, but they came fast. Richard Hale, the executive in the pinstriped suit, was out of a job by the next morning. Someone on the flight had recorded his comments. The video spread online like wildfire, and his LinkedIn profile was scrubbed clean. 20 years of carefully built reputation gone in a single day. Tara Wells found her latest sponsorship deal cancelled. Her followers dropped by the thousands overnight. Her apology post was buried under a flood of comments calling her out. Olivia Hart faced a formal reprimand from the airline for unprofessional conduct. She was reassigned to short domestic routes. Her dreams of international flights were grounded indefinitely. Ethan Carter's startup lost a major investor. The news broke quietly but decisively. Claire Donovan's law firm issued a public apology and reassigned her away from high-profile cases. But Rachel didn't orchestrate any of this. She didn't post the video or fuel the backlash. She simply existed, and the truth had a way of speaking for itself. She'd been through worse than their words, missions where the sky was fire, where one wrong move meant no coming back. This was just noise, the kind of noise she'd learned to tune out long ago. Rachel stood at the edge of the tarmac in D.C., her husband beside her, the helmet still under her arm. The city stretched out before them, a reminder of why she was here. Not for the passengers, not for the recognition, but for something bigger, something that had always driven her, even when the world tried to make her small. The wind tugged at her hoodie, but she didn't pull it tighter. She just stood there, steady, grounded, unmoved. The world had doubted her, mocked her, tried to make her feel like she didn't belong. But she wasn't small. She never had been. And for anyone watching who's ever been judged, overlooked or silenced, anyone who's had their worth measured by the wrong people, this is your moment. You're not small either. You never were. The people who matter will always see you, no matter what you're wearing or where you're sitting. Because real value doesn't come from appearances or first impressions. It comes from who you are when nobody's watching. It comes from the missions you've completed, the lives you've changed, the squadrons you've brought home. So here's my question for you. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below. Tell me your story. If you've ever been underestimated and proved them wrong, I want to hear it. And hit that follow button, because there are more stories like this coming. Stories of the people the world tried to diminish, and they're waiting for you. Thank you for being here. The cabin fell silent in a way that only happens when the world shifts beneath your feet and nobody knows how to respond. Moments before, the business class lounge had been alive with laughter at her expense. A woman in a sharp blazer and designer glasses had smirked at her frayed hoodie, the kind of look that said, "How did you even afford this flight?" A man in a pinstriped suit, his Rolex catching the cabin light, had leaned toward his seatmate with a whispered jab that carried just enough volume to reach her ears. "Probably one of those discount ticket people," he'd said, and his friend had laughed, the kind of laugh that echoed through the cabin like permission to judge. The flight attendant, Olivia Hart, had delivered the final blow with surgical precision. She was in her mid-40s, with sharp eyes that sized people up in seconds, and a smile that never reached anywhere important. "Economy class, dear," she'd said, her tone laced with faint disdain. "But today the plane's full, so you'll just have to sit here in 12F. It's not ideal, I know, but it's what we have available." A few business-class passengers had chuckled, catching the undertone perfectly. The implication was clear: you don't belong here. But then the plane touched down at Andrews Air Force Base, and everything changed in a way that no one in that cabin could have predicted. Her name was Rachel Monroe, and she looked like she'd barely scraped together enough for a last-minute ticket. The Seattle airport had been a blur of motion that morning, but her reality was sharper than that. She moved through the crowds in a worn army green hoodie, the cuffs frayed from years of use, the hem loose in one corner. Her jeans had a small tear at the knee, barely noticeable unless you were looking for flaws, which it seemed everyone was. Her dark, wavy hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and her face was bare. No makeup, no jewelry, not even a hint of effort to appear put together. That had stopped mattering to her years ago. Her backpack was old, faded olive drab with a patch from a military base that held more memories than comfort. As she made her way down the narrow aisle of the plane, Rachel didn't flinch at the glances. She didn't adjust her posture to appear smaller or less threatening. Her eyes stayed fixed on the row numbers above, her movements deliberate and calm. She wasn't here to prove anything to anyone. She just needed to get to DC, and she had long ago learned that the opinions of strangers were noise, the kind of noise that you could tune out if you knew how. Inside, Rachel knew who she was. She knew what she'd done. She knew the missions that lived in classified vaults, the calls that had saved lives, the nights when the sky was fire and she'd brought her squadron home. Every single one. The woman in the sharp blazer didn't see that. The businessman in the pinstriped suit didn't see that, and she was perfectly fine with that. Rachel stowed her backpack under the seat in front of her and settled into 12F, the window seat. The guy next to her, mid-40s with a Rolex that screamed new money, gave her a quick once-over before turning back to his tablet. His name tag read Richard Hale, and his cologne was strong enough to make her blink. She didn't care. She had learned long ago to let judgment roll off her like water. As the plane climbed into the sky, the hum of the engines settling into a steady drone, Rachel gazed out the window, watching the clouds roll past like waves. Her hands rested in her lap, calloused from years of gripping controls and cockpits that most people would never see. But no one in this cabin could know that just by looking at her. The disrespect came in waves, each one slightly sharper than the last. During the meal service, Olivia paused by Rachel's row, holding a tray of business-class menus. She glanced at Rachel's hoodie, then handed the menu to Richard Hale with a warm smile. "I'm sorry, we only have enough for our premium passengers," she said, loud enough for others to hear. Her eyes flicked to Rachel with a hint of superiority that was impossible to miss. A man in a tailored blazer 2 rows ahead turned back, his laugh low and mocking. "Don't worry, she's probably used to fast food," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. The cabin rippled with chuckles, and Rachel's hand stilled on her water bottle. She looked up, her eyes meeting Olivia's for a brief moment. "Water's fine," she said, her voice soft but firm, like a line drawn in sand. Olivia blinked, caught off guard, then moved on, her heels clicking faster than before. Rachel leaned back, her fingers tapping once against the armrest, a small, controlled motion that said more than words ever could. Hours passed. The cabin settled into a rhythm of clinking glasses and murmured conversations, the kind of noise that comes from people who think they're important. Richard Hale kept glancing Rachel's way, his eyes narrowing like he was trying to figure her out. Finally he spoke, his voice thick with condescension. "You look like you're headed to a job interview or something," he said. "Hope you've got a better outfit in that bag." Rachel turned her head just enough to meet his eyes. "I'm good," she said, her voice low and steady, like a blade sliding into place.